Oh yeah, I get.
Okay, we should be running.
All right. All right. Yeah. This is really a nice little recorder, and it's not top of the line. It's about 2 or 3 down. All right. We're looking at the basic cosmological cycle of ongoing consciousness. And we have reached the turnaround point in the cosmological cycle. You might say we have reached the winter solstice because the perception that we started with in the external world is now as deep inward as it is going to go. It has been presented to the self, which is functioning inside the concrete mind. Now, not all perceptions get as far as to the self. Sometimes we lose interest and we lose conscious perception. We withdraw from conscious perception. It's still hitting our eyes and all, but it isn't getting to us, the spirit. So some responses don't even require going in this deeply. They don't require self-conscious judgment. They're automatic, and there are immediate automatic responses. But where we're looking at it now, we're looking at where the percept is presented to the self, to the spiritual ego. And at this point, things are very, very difficult for several reasons. One, because of my stupidity. This is hard stuff. I'm not sure that I have a lot of answers for all of this. But there are other reasons. One is that there is variation from individual to individual in terms of engagement with the outer world. Some drivers are inattentive. In my early days, I was a very inattentive driver. I would be withdrawn and be thinking about other things. I can remember going down the freeway to San Diego and solving problems of spiritual mathematics in the back of my mind, while it was going on, while I was driving. It's only been in the last 20 or 25 years that I've even started to be more engaged. And I'm actually a better driver now than I was 25 years ago. Good evening, Bonnie. And in fact, I just recently took one. Have you seen those tests on the internet where you're given a chance to react to something? I think you sent me one, didn't you? And I had the reactions of somebody that was 40 or 45 years old. I was surprised at all of that. All right. Now, modern Western mysticism is clear that sense perception is important, extremely important to our evolution in spiritual development. In fact, some schools say that the first stages of our future development come through sensory work. We didn't come all this way into matter to issue it and get away from it. We came here to pass through it and to transform it, and that involves sense perception. Now, Western aspirants of all varieties are urged to practice excellent or as good a perception as they can, to see the external world or hear it or feel it or whatever as well as can be done, but not to become attached to it or to get involved in some kind of sensualism or something like that, which has personal indulgences involved with it. beside the differences of one individual to another as far as engagement in the senses is concerned, there are other differences with regard to concluding what comes from sense perception. To some degree, each self is different than every other self. But this is something that requires extremely careful consideration. Otherwise, serious errors come about. Now, all selves, all spiritual egos, are foci. They're foci within and of life spirit. The self, or a human spirit, is a focus of the pure spirit, life spirit. This means that all human selves are precipitated out of the same selfness, out of the same truth. And it means that the selves are ideas. So each of us in our being as a self is actually an idea of a divine being. And in this regard, our concept or our idea of a being is no different than the idea of God. So a lot of mystics say to know oneself is to know God. Of course, the depth and the development that has passed through the self that we call God is almost infinitely more than what we have done. Now, there's much more that could be said about this, but it would be only a distraction now. We want to get on to matters that are a little bit more germane. Now, if the question at hand is, if we are all foci of one universal spirit, one life spirit, which is selfness, how can one self be different from another? Now we get an answer to this in a vague way if we go out and look at the stars. Now they are all compounded out of the same stuff. Each star, which is the visible expression of a divine being, a God, is different in color and different in intensity and brightness, so that even when we get to the divine beings that are well developed in their self, there is difference. When we talk about the self being an idea or a focus of selfness out of life spirit, we're talking about it at its birth, at its conception. And at that time, it's pure. We're seeing it before waking experience. So that's, to us, it's almost a theoretical purity, because experience hasn't been absorbed into it and it hasn't differentiated. But by now, after a few thousands of years of waking into full self-consciousness in the external world, the selves are different because they've had different experiences. Now, if we look at it like stars, if we've had billions of years of experience before the birth of selfhood and many millennia since then, how can we be greatly different from each other? We're still trying to get at that idea. The first thing about it all is it's a matter of proportion. In reality, in our selfness, we are more alike than we are different. What happens is if we see one person being different from another, we tend to exaggerate that because we are in a world where the discrimination of difference is an important thing, and we place a lot of emphasis on it. But when we're talking about divinity and the glory of one divinity versus another, it's almost negligible. Now, in our example, we're speaking about selfhood relative to the external world. And in that reference, difference, no matter how small, is important. If one has given oneself to engaging and mastering the external world over a number of lives, the flavor of oneself becomes developed from the soul material derived from those experiences. Someone who has engaged is more apt to be different because of the different experiences. Now, lurking in all of this is an almost impossibly difficult question. If we were all of the same spirit and of virgin purity to begin with, how could we differ at all? Given that we had no self-consciousness or no self-will until way down the line. This is something that is too hard for me. I can't answer that. I'll take a crack at it when we get to the next major sub-series. But for right now, it's a tough question. How can we be different from each other? It's almost like asking a question, how can an atom of one element in a stone be different from the atom, from another atom of the same element in the same stone? It seems impossible, and other than point of view, it seems that they have to be identical. But it doesn't work out that way, and the answers are hard to come by. At any rate, there are several questions that are important in all of this. Fortunately, I get to put them off until a later time. All right, let's look at other differences of oneself from another self. This is going to be nothing but side trips all night tonight. One difference between oneself and another is the degree of awakeness. We've touched on this before, and some people balk at that kind of distinction, and they think, I am awake. There's nothing more to being awake than being awake. Well, self-consciousness is illusory, and it is relative. We always tend to think that we're as awake as we can be. However, if you've had something like a baptism by the Holy Spirit and have been awake like you never believed was possible before, there's no question about selves or individuals being relatively awake. Some humans are only semi-self-conscious. Their consciousness is more in the group, and individuation is foreign to them. In fact, people who have more consciousness in group consciousness than in individual consciousness, things like psychotherapy don't work on them. If you try to use Jungian or Freudian or whatever type of psychotherapy on some people, it doesn't take, because they don't define or see the world that way. They see it in the consciousness of the family. It's almost like animals in a group. They have like a family spirit, in the way that animals have a group spirit. Self-consciousness is in and about or to the world. We've spoken about this before also, but it's worth repeating again and again. And it is only here that we can develop self-consciousness, because it is only here that we can produce and gain conscious soul. At some other time in evolution that will be different, but right now the consciousness, the potentiality for consciousness that we have can only be derived here. There are some people who don't have that kind of self-consciousness. They're unconscious to human abstractions, and they're even unconscious to human abstractions or modifications of the world. You know that there are people, I don't know if there are anymore, but there are people that have been in my lifetime that if you take and show them a photograph, they don't see it as a photograph. They see it as a sheet of paper, or they don't even know if they have the concept of paper. They see it as a sheet of paper with some funny markings on it. And the idea of abstracting a flat image into being the picture of someone, they don't have that. It's, and if you think about it, a lot of us were, to begin with, we talked just a few minutes ago about that purity of a newborn self. All of us were in that boat, and you still find people in the world like that now. At what is called the fall of humanity, it was the self that fell. There was no separative personality. There was no lower ego. It was the real self, because it was innocent. And in its innocence, it was capable of being beguiled, and, it fell for it. Now, I hope that if we're speeding down the highway at highway speeds, that there isn't someone that is so virgin to experience here that they are unalarmed by seeing a car coming at them from the other direction. So the same thing is true in our example of trying to pass another car with an oncoming car coming. There are some people who understand the situation better than others. And it's not from a mathematical point of view, it's just that they are more self-conscious and they can judge more clearly what is going on. In fact, some even see circumstances beyond beyond what is in the physical perception. I can remember I used to love to weave in and out on Los Angeles freeways. It was an exciting thing to me. And one of the things was that you could, if you were really in touch with what you were doing, you could tell when somebody was going to change lanes before they did it, and that you could make you could make motions according to that. And I found that very engaging, but I tried to take the next step forward from there, and I said, whoa, I can't do that. And that was to make the driver change lanes. Okay. Some people even see the psychology and I can always tell with a backseat driver what's going on in their consciousness. And if I'm making a judgment and their judgment is different, it is a distraction. On some circumstances, when people go, like that, when you're making a judgment to do something, as soon as I can, I pull the car over and say, you drive. I'm not going to work in that. All right. In any case, the driver, the self that is the driver, receives the sensory information, makes a judgment, and acts accordingly. The driver, he or she, either accelerates or decelerates, or doesn't need to do either to pass. When that judgment is made and action is to be the consequence of it, this activates the extroversive stage of the cycle. Now, the extroversive stage of the cycle is the inverse of the introversive. That is to say, the first thing in the extroversive is the mental part, in the mind, whereas in the introversive, that's the last thing. So we're at the turnaround, and the self leaves off from being the truth knower and the judge, and instead becomes the thinker or the doer. So there are different functions in the same self. Now, in the extroversive phase of the cycle, thinking is different from thinking on the introversive phase of the cycle. During introversion, it is much more questioning, because questioning is how the information is drawn out of the impressions that come from the desire world. In extroversion, there is more of an impetus to action. Now, the thought is impelled, and the strength of that thought depends on the general will of the spirit. Not a specific will, but the general willpower of the whole threefold spirit. It also depends on the skill of the thinker, and it depends on the intent of the thinker. We probably have all, even in this class, encountered feeble and forceful thinkers. I'm in the former category. Now, I think this calls for a digression to clarify something that I think a lot of people do not understand. When we speak about the strength of a thought, it can summon up images like a battering ram trying to knock down a door or something like that. That kind of strength. Now, it is true that repeated thoughts directed against someone else, which is what a hypnotist does, can have a battering effect. It can break down the will of another person. But that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about strength of a thought. From my own experience, I have come to see that there are two factors in determining the strength of a thought. There may be more, but these are the ones that are obvious enough for me to see. The first and the most obvious factor determining the strength of a thought is concentration. It's not some kind of impelling, it is concentration. The more concentrated one is with one's mind, the more potent are the thoughts that are produced. And concentration in this sense is like concentration in chemical reagents. Concentrated hydrochloric acid is pure hydrochloric acid with no foreign agencies in it whatsoever. A concentrated thought is a thought in which only that thought is in the mind of the thinker. Only that. So this takes a great will to put one's attention in such a way into the mind to think so that it can be pure, only that thought and it only. So when we're talking about strength of a thought, we're talking about the ability to take a hold of the mind and have it focus and do what you want it to do. In a way, it is like bearing down on the thought so that nothing to distract from it. If we focus on something to the exclusion of everything else, that is an evacuation in the world of thought. We've been talking about thinking being an evacuative process. This is another example of how that is, or watching what we're doing when we're doing it. Now the spirit, or the self, may have greater intents beyond one thought, but they can only be accomplished by one thought being completed and then another and then another. It is one of the great errors that humans make, is to run off with what is called a train of thought or a line of thought without having really produced a thought that is clear and sound and strong. Now, the second factor, I don't know how to put this into words, seems to be attendant to the first factor. In fact, I'm not sure that it isn't the same factor seen in a different potential. The second factor in the strength of a thought is the duration of how long the concentration is sustained. Now, the first of these factors I've gained from working inwardly. Practicing in spiritual exercises, it's become very clear that this is what one has to do in order to produce a strong thought. The second factor, the duration factor, is what I have learned from astrology. And it applies to thinking. That the longer an astrological phenomenon occurs, the more potent it is as far as making a change. Now, if creating a thought form by concentration is hollowing out thought stuff in space, it's conceivable to me, though I don't have the deep enough understanding to verify it completely, it's conceivable to me that sustaining a thought is concentration applied to the potential of time rather than to the potential of space. So that both factors might be, in fact, the very same thing, depending on whether your perspective is from space and matter or from time and spirit. Now, this is very different way of conceiving things, but I don't think it's untrue. The time, when we're talking about time and space in the world of thought, we're talking about something that are very different from time and space here. Because time gets greatly expanded in the world of thought compared to here. Like what is a very short time here, like a fraction of a second here, is in the consciousness, in that concentrated consciousness of the world thought is greatly expanded. And so we have somebody like Mozart, who could concentrate like that, and in a fraction of a second, he could hear an entire symphony in the world of thought. He had that tonal vision. All right, this gives us some rough idea of how a thought form is manifested. Now we want to know what comes next in affecting that in the world. Now, this is an embarrassing night because I'm now in a position that I'm not sure that I even understand the essentials about this. I have read books about it, and I've heard talks about it, and I have been in discussions with other mystical aspirants, but I'm not sure that I really understand even the most basic essentials. What is said by those who are sure and who are convincing, and they make sense, but there are large gaps in the information, and so that a fundamentalist like myself, if I can't understand it every step of the way or every gradation of the way, or I don't know how you would say it, I don't think I know it. And so if I read books by great mystics, Heindel, Steiner, all of those, I read what they say, and it makes sense to me, but there are gaps. So I'm trying to look into those gaps, and it's something like when they looked at that dark spot in the heavens with the super powerful telescope, and they found out there was a whole number of universes, and something like that is what happens. The thing we're wanting to understand, at least a little bit, is the interaction between worlds. That's what cosmology is all about. Cosmography tells us what the spiritual worlds are, what they are substantially, and cosmology tells us how they function in themselves and with each other. Now in this, Max Heindel makes a very beautiful statement. It's a poetically beautiful statement about how the functioning of spiritual worlds goes when he says, anything that happens in one world affects every other world. I just mispronouncing those words affected every other word. Now that statement is exquisite for illustrating how sensitive the cosmos is. And it's wonderful for seeing how unified the cosmos is. But it doesn't tell, at least in detail, how it all works. Now some of this, again, is just, I'm going to just mention some things in passing, and when we get to the next major sub-series, we'll go into it at length. And Tim will even produce things to help us with this. As far as I can tell, it's all about resonance and resonant impingement. When we get to that next major, when we get done with cosmology and get to the next major sub-series, we will explore how the worlds and the regions within the worlds are undertones from the cosmic word, from the primordial word. We'll look into that. Tim might even bring in musical instruments. He did a great talk about undertones a couple of years ago. Now, this isn't real simple because there are analogous subscales and echo-reflective scales and things like that between all the worlds, so that it's not an easy thing, it's not just something you can block out real quickly. For now, we just want to understand something very simple about adjacent worlds. Now, if we take a stick and poke it in the water and swish it around, we roil the water. If we take that same stick and put it in the air and swish it around, we roil the air, but not as much as we did the water. while we're doing it in the air, we are also doing it simultaneously in the ethers. But in the ethers, the roiling is almost non-existent. And if we think about it, in the desire world, because it's a completely different world, we're not doing anything because it's a different world. Now, we've seen, while studying this cosmological cycle, that energetic images in the higher ethers do impinge in a, I hate to use the word, vibrational kind of way, resonance is probably a better way, they do affect the lower vibrating nature of the desire world, so that even though they are different worlds, there is some resonant quality between the higher ethers and the lower desire world that causes an interactivity between the worlds. From this, we can generalize, maybe not safely, but we can generalize that resonant extremes in the worlds can affect, or quasi-directly affect, the worlds they are adjacent to. The resonant extremes are of higher frequency and lower frequency. So the higher frequency of the ethers in interaction with the lower frequency of the desire world. Now, in this, I'm using some rather awkward language, and that is by intention. I want to use that awkward language because there are among many students of mysticism illusory ideas, and people begin to think of the worlds in relation to each other like a stack of pancakes or something like that. And that's just not, not the way it is. Interpenetration and resonance between worlds are hard to understand. At least they're hard to understand experientially. We could do the famous thing in here. We could bring in a glass and find a pitch that shatters the glass, and there's nothing in between, but there's something that interpenetrates. So at least we have music and sound to help us. All right, so we now understand that the thought, in order to be effective, has to pass between worlds. We could have gone into this during the introversus cycle, but it would have been way too much. Now, with this in mind, we want to examine the options for the thought that we have just created, the judgment and the move to action that the self has made. Now, mystics claim that there are three options, but those three options exist in greater possibilities. And right now we want to approach this by looking at the greater possibilities, because they're the only logical possibilities at all. The thought can be used in relation to a higher world, or it can be used in the same world, or it can be used in a lower world. These are the only possibilities that there are. There may be options within those possibilities, and that's what we're going to look at. But if we look at the first of these, we encounter an impossibility, because the next higher region is the region of abstract, the subdivision of that is abstract rather than concrete. And one cannot project a concrete thought into that subdivision. Abstract is abstract and concrete is concrete. Now the spirit working the other way around, can abstract the essence out of a thought and into the higher mind and beyond, but then it is no longer a concrete thought. This is something also that we're going to come back to again when it's more fruitful. So if we're trying to do this, trying to place a concrete thought into the region of abstract thought, we're doing what in folklore they say, you can't take it with you. And they say they have never seen a hearse pulling a U-Haul behind it, meaning to say that the things that we have gathered in this world we can't take into the inner world. We can take the essence of them of the experiences, but we can't take them wholesale into the inner worlds. Okay. The second possibility is activating or using the thought on the same level. And it yields some interesting results also. And this is something that can be done and is frequently done. But how it is done is extremely important. Now again, this is again from personal observation, as well as pondering on the thoughts of others. There are two ways of using thoughts in the world of thought. One of them is highly objectionable in terms of spiritual ethics. The two ways are to project thoughts to the mind of another thinker. And the other is to, I don't know how to reverberate a thought so that whoever can resonate with it can pick it up. This is very much like a radio station. It broadcasts into the world, and whoever tunes in can pick it up. It isn't forced on you. Projecting thoughts onto the mind of someone else is spiritual assault. It's a mental assault. To force something into the mind of another where their self-consciousness is focused is to not respect their divinity. They have a divine autonomy, they have a divine dignity, and that is, you can't encroach on that. You can do that, and you can be successful depending on the strength of your thought and the receptivity of the other person. Now, I even using the word person is wrong there, because if you project your thoughts to the mind of an archangel, you're not likely to be successful in obtaining your ends, because our thoughts are pretty feeble. Now, if you're projecting to another human mind, especially if the other human is not a practiced thinker, and the other individual, the other human, is not has not practiced a lot of self-knowing, that thought will appear to that person as if it is their own, because they don't know their own tone of their own voice. This is the way hypnotists and black magicians work. This is, it is to encroach on people's divine rights. Resonance is the ethical way to communicate mentally. The way to think of it is that if the Creator with a capital C manifests the cosmos through resonance, and everything within it within the creation is the product of a resonance. And if we are created in the spiritual image of the Creator, then it is most natural for us to manifest through resonance. If you are extremely, extremely fortunate and able to interact or communicate with a true spiritual teacher, the entire communication will be through resonance. This is the way the initiation of the initiatory process works. The teacher focuses on cosmic facts pertinent to accomplishing the activity of initiation, and if the student can bring his or her consciousness up to such a level that they can resonate with it, they see that. Or they, I don't know, use the word see, it makes it all too visual. Now, that's the way it is accomplished. Now, this is something that I bet you everybody in this room has experienced. Suppose you're in a lively discussion, maybe 7, 8 people, and everybody's excited about it, and everybody wants to speak at the same time. Now, in such a circumstance, if you got a lot of will, you can be boorish and you can force yourself into the stream of the discussion. And if you justify yourself saying, well, what I have to say is so important, you better listen, with that kind of an attitude, you can do it. But you don't have to. If you just hold your thought, hold your consciousness on the truth of what you want to communicate, eventually someone or several other people will pick up that thought resonantly, and you didn't have to do anything boorish. I'm sure that everyone has experienced that, and often if a person isn't familiar with this kind of communication, they say, well, that person stole my thought. It goes like that. The most important and the most beautiful thing about resonant communication is that it allows freedom, whereas projection does not. And it usually ends up in enmity, because sometime or another the worm turns and someone has had enough of having their divine rights violated, and they respond, and the responding is not pleasant always. All right, this brings us now to the third possibility, the one that we want to get at, and that is using the thought in a or in other lower worlds. In this, there are limitations and there are options which are both good and bad. One of the limitations is, we've already covered it to some extent, and that is that a person cannot project a thought to any lower world. That is to say, you can't project the thought directly into chemical stuff. It can only be done by resonating or presenting or projecting it against the adjacent lower world. We're at that point again where there is the possibility of resonant transfer from one world to another. This is how the universe is structured. It may be that all the worlds relative to each other are like a standing wave, and that there is a sensitivity that passes through them, but you just can't do it. You can't. Again, you can't, like the same way you can't take material stuff into the desire world and the higher spiritual worlds. You can't take the higher spiritual worlds and jump and place them anywhere in the lower worlds. It turns out that to do it this way produces a fully satisfying experience. There's something about an experience that is total. Again, we can go to an image where this is something that botanists fight over. What is the plant? Is it the flower? Is it the leaf? Or is it the fruit? Well, the plant is all of them. And the plant is a process. It's a cosmological process where it's taken through its cycle. And that cycle is not just that this is the way we have to do it. It is because doing it this way gives a full experience. And when we're talking about manifesting a thought by bringing it through the desire world and the etheric world and into the chemical stuff, we're talking about a full experience, something that is complete. There's a kind of a great satisfaction for that. Now, in directing thoughts to a lower world, there is one exception. And that exception is that there is a special resonance between the concrete mind and the reflecting ether of the etheric vital body. There's a special resonance. This means that a thought can pass directly to the ethers, bypassing the desire body. However, it's not a complete experience when you do that. It will not be clothed in desire stuff, and therefore it will not provoke action. So you do this when you have reasons other than producing an action. Now, there are several really nice features to this. For one, the memory in the reflecting ether is much more accessible. Very few people can read out of the world of thought, but almost anyone with good self-control and the will to do so can call back images out of the reflecting ether. If you're doing something like a retrospective exercise, if you really want to be purged of something, or if you really want to harvest an experience, you can call back an image that is a photographic image. It's not easy to do, and you have to practice and you have to work very hard at it, but it can be done. So this is something that's accessible. And it's accessible not only in the moment that the thought is created and placed into the reflecting ether, it's accessible later on. The second thing is that in the reflecting ether, there is a kind of subconscious mind, I hate to use that word because that's so loaded with so many different meanings, that ramifies and carries out thoughts. That is, one thought can fan out, like inductive thinkers like to say thoughts fan out, and all kinds of logical conclusions can be drawn if this and this and if this and this and if this and this. This is something that that happens to some people who withdraw from the physical world. This is what happens to paranoics. It's fascinating to see somebody going through a paranoid train of thought, how this is related to this, related to this, is related to this, and it's all against me. This is somebody that's withdrawn from the physical world because the physical world is too much for them. And they've, all right, I don't want to go into that, it'd be too big. But this is something, again, that anybody can experience. I experienced it about 48 years ago, the first time. There are those kinds of problems that have many potential solutions. And they're basically mental problems. They're not something that deals with the nature of stuff or something like that. And I was working on such a problem. And I was working at it for quite a while. And then I decided to take a nap. But it was at a time of the day that I never took naps. So when I took a nap, I didn't go completely under, but I was in the reflecting ether, and it was phenomenal. It was like the thought trains that were spreading out, and I didn't know that I was doing this all along. It's almost like you set a computer program running, and it does this and this and this, and this is something that any time you're thinking and trying to solve a problem, it sometimes takes several days before the option comes to full consciousness, but you're working on it in the reflecting ether, and it's available to you. So that's one of. So if there's something that you don't need to act on immediately, and that if it isn't something that requires motivation, and you want to look at all the possibilities. That projection of the thought into the reflecting ether, we don't, most people don't think of that. Okay, and I'm focusing on the reflecting ether. But they think about it, and their thoughts accomplish that. It happens quite frequently. Some people have it in their dreams. They come to a conclusion. There's the famous one of the man who is considered one of the most brilliant scientific minds of all time. What was his name? The man who discovers specific gravity and leverage, Archimedes. He was working on a problem, and he went to sleep, and in his sleep it was carried out. And when he woke up, he had the answer, and he was running down the street in his nightshirt, I believe, yelling, "Eureka, Eureka, Eureka," which means I have found it. All right. So this is something we can all do, and it is among the psychic kinds of things that you can do. This one is relatively harmless. It's learning to access things in that way. Now, when it comes to projecting a thought to a lower world or to a vehicle in a lower world, the ethics are the same as they are with the mind itself. One does not violate someone else's spiritual sovereignty. You respect it. Now, you can project things on other people's desire body, and you can project things on the reflecting ether of somebody else's soul body. And I had that experience about 52 years ago. It was a big experience for me. It was just a very few weeks after I had had a minor mystical experience. And I was extremely sensitive. And I was extremely emotionally sensitive in that the remembrance of the experience would bring me to tears and all of that. At the time, I was working outdoors in Tucson, Arizona. My job was I worked for the Borden's Milk Company, and I washed milk trucks. And there is that hour right before sunrise and right after sunset. It's a very magical time. It's the time when the light is different altogether, and the ethers are rich, and they seem to be much more accessible. It's the time of the day when most people see fairies or other nature spirits for the first time, right after sunset or right before sunrise. And I was in the parking lot of the Borden's Milk Company, and I was backing a truck into its stall in order to plug it in so that the cooler would charge overnight and it would, keep the dairy products cold while the milkman was on his route. And it was at that magic hour, and I looked across the lot, and there was the full-time mechanic. And I looked at him, and without knowing it, I was seeing his etheric aura. I wasn't trying to do it, but I was seeing his etheric aura. And as I looked at the aura, I was thinking, saying, wow, that's much richer than I would expect that somebody like that to have. And I had several thoughts. And then I went about backing the truck in and plugging it in. And as fast as that man could run across the lot, he was in my face. And he said to me, what were you just thinking? I told him exactly what you were just thinking, what I was just thinking. And he said to me, it was as if you were standing right next to me speaking that to me. So if you are capable of seeing the etheric aura of someone else, you are capable of projecting your thoughts to their reflecting ether as well as to your own. It was a big moment for him because we became very dear spiritual friends. And he had a child that was an interesting child. The child liked to climb trees. And the child liked to hang by his knees off the limb of a tree. But when he got upside down, the change in perspective was so funny to him that he'd start laughing. And he'd laugh and laugh until he wasn't holding the limb anymore. He'd fall down or break an arm or do something like that. Very nice man. I never saw him again. But that was instructional for him. It changed his life as far as thinking about spiritual things. And it changed mine. Because I realized that unwittingly I had committed unconscious black magic. I had put something in his consciousness that wasn't supposed to be there. If he would pick it up from me, that would be something different. But putting it in him, it was not a right thing to do. And on top of that, I realized just how definite thoughts are as things. A thought is a thing that you just can't deny it. It was, in a way, it was as if I had thrown a baseball to him. So the most usual manifestation of a thought is to project it in one's own desire body. I don't know, you say project it into or onto or through or what, because prepositions in any language are difficult, and when you're trying to talk about spiritual things where there's an interdimensionality, it's even more difficult. And when this is done, this is the normal path of extroversion. That thought enters the region of feeling. And if it gets to the central feelings of interest and indifference, and if there is indifference, the thought will have no effect. This is for all those mentalists that think all I have to do is think clear thoughts, true thoughts, and I'll change the world. No, you won't. Unless you have interest, and in that interest can bring a motive force to your thoughts that is more accessible in the lower realms, it will not be effective. Normally, it meets with interest, especially if we're going down the highway at 60 miles an hour or something like that. And when that happens, according to the nature of the thought, it attracts, remember it's an evacuative thing, it attracts desire stuff to it. And then that desire stuff is carried out, it is a motive, and it is brought into the etheric vital body. And in the etheric vital body, it carries into the dense physical where it is finalized. In our case, we either step on the brakes or we lift off the gas pedal and we accelerate or decelerate, And this is all going on all the time. This cosmological cycle is going on so fast that sometimes before the final decision is made or before the change of action is made, it has been many cycles. And sometimes we know this, if we're dealing with a process that we're not familiar with, we decide to do something one way, and as the cycle goes on, we can see that that's not enough, and then we have to change it along the way. But this is the most, as long as we are alive and as long as we are awake, this is a cosmological cycle that is going on. This is what we are here for. We are here to experience the external world. We are here to change the external world, and there's a purpose behind it. But basically, all is effected through this kind of cycle. All right. This has been having a lot of side trips and things along the way. Not all of the cosmological cycles are full-blown. Sometimes the thought intentionally gets no further than the desire world. Suppose you're a poet or something like that, and you're trying to establish an emotional atmosphere, and your thoughts then go into the desire world and produce that emotional atmosphere. Some of them have to carry through in order to write down something symbolic on a sheet of paper that can bring the reader to that atmosphere that you've created. But much of the creation of an artistic atmosphere doesn't have to carry all the way through into the physical world. It is the emotional setting that you are making, and it is a very good artist that can do things that way. All right, I told you it was nothing but tangents. Next time we'll stay with this cycle, but we're going to look at some of the larger things concerning it. And then we'll move on to the next cosmological cycle, which will probably take us at least a year. And there'll be even more and larger and longer side trips. My whole life is a divertimento. Any questions? Okay, thank you very much.